Assalamualaikum, selamat sejahtera and a very good afternoon to everyone. I'm Suraya Ismail, Director of Research, Khazanah Research Institute, KRI, and I will be the moderator for today's events. Today's events will have two parts. Part one, the launch of the book, Buying Time for Climate Action, and followed by part two, a panel discussion on financing for climate action. We will have a 2-minute break between the book launch and the panel session. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we have the pleasure of launching a book, Buying Time for Climate Action, an exploration into ways around stumbling blocks, edited by Jan Westbinder and Jonathan Sim. What is this book about? Well, we have one of the editors with us today, Professor Jan Westbinder, who will give an overview of this book, and later a video from the contributors of this book. However, if I may offer a glimpse of this book, a verbatim from the pages, it is about, quote unquote, ways to deal with the mess that global climate change creates and the stumbling blocks that we encounter when trying to stir away from this mess. I think there is no other way to directly say this. Ladies and gentlemen, before we launch the book, I would like to invite our chairman and trustees of Khazanah Research Institute, KRI, Tan Sri Noor Muhammad Yaakob, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Suraya. Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Our distinguished panelists, Tan Sri Andrew Sheng, Jan Westbinder, Professor Jomo Mina Rahman, Faisal Parish, In Shaolong, of course, our moderator, Dr. Suraya Ismail, and all our guests joining us online. First, I would like to welcome one and all to our book launch, Buying Time for Climate Action, and our panel on financing for climate action. This, I reckon, is a timely event. In the wake of last month's United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, and the heated, sometimes very heated negotiations over climate finance between developing and developed countries. I would like to thank very much Tan Sri Andrew for wanting to discuss this issue with KRI. The climate crisis is a ticking clock, an existential threat for millions of people who face extreme weather events, who face floods, who face droughts, who face sea level rise, and who face threats to their very livelihood. While Malaysia is not a major emitter of the greenhouse gases responsible for climate change, we are, unfortunately, vulnerable to its effects. Protecting vulnerable communities, protecting vulnerable sectors, and preventing further loss and damage will require structural transformation of our economies to reduce our contribution towards climate change, as well as to reduce our vulnerabilities. Structural transformation of this nature will require greater financial resources. Our economy is indeed caught between recovering from the pandemic and preparing to avert this future crisis. If we do not act early enough this decade, climate impacts would impose a further burden on our economy and jeopardize long-term development. It is an accident waiting to happen. We must not let it happen. I congratulate Tan Sri Andrew and Jen on their book, and I look forward to their views from our panel. Thank you, Suraya.
Thank you, Tan Sri. I would like to introduce our speaker today, Professor Jan Westbinder. Professor Jan Westbinder is founding president of the Institute Paralimes, which he initiated in 2003. He moved to Singapore in August 2011 to become director of the Complexity Program at the Nanyang Technological University at Singapore. Professor Vestbinder studied physics at the Technical University of Delft and started his professional career as a researcher in a nuclear laboratory. His research interests are focused on finding new, potentially powerful combinations of knowledge and developing programs to explore and exploit these combinations. In his career, the common thread is looking for new combinations and connections, building bridges and coaching. His motto is, quote unquote, the value of knowledge is in its application. May I now invite Professor Jan Vestbinder, founding president, Institute Paralimes, to give the special address. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Soraya, for this very nice introduction, and good morning, everyone. The origin of the book, Buying Time, lies in the conference, Disrupted Balance and Societies at Risk, that took place in Singapore 5 years ago, in December 2016. The conference dealt with the resilience of societies in the face of major disruptions. 12 speakers, each uniquely qualified to address this issue, presented their views on possible causes for major disruptions in systems that are essential to keep our societies going. Andrew Sheng was one of the speakers. The general consensus of the conference was, unless we do something, humanity is heading for a big crash. We have the knowledge to avoid such a crash, but we need to act. The key question is what to do, how to do it, and where to start. The key conclusions of the conference were that the changing global climate poses existential threats to humanity that needs to be proactively countered by actions. And the second conclusion was that we can eliminate those threats, but there is precious little time left to design and execute those actions. These conclusions led to the project Buying Time that started in 2018. The key purpose of that project was to create time to mitigate the consequences of climate change. To create time to mitigate the consequences of climate change. The first major milestone was to be a conference, Buying Time, in Vienna in 2020, where action plans were to be presented and discussed on different areas where we expected climate change to generate existential risks. Areas such as health, water, food, fishing, flooding of coastal areas, and finance. Early January 2020, in a 3-day workshop in the Netherlands, the structure and context within which the action plans were to be developed were agreed upon. And then COVID hit and totally disrupted all the plans. It also transformed Zoom to a global communication medium. Through Zoom, a small working group set out to develop action plans. In the period of a year, this group got together once or twice a month, always between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock p.m. Central European time, because that was the only time to get the people in Asia, the United States, and Europe online together. In its many in-depth, wide-ranging, and sometimes fierce discussion, this group of 7 came to a sobering conclusion. Most action plans do not include pathways that deal with the stumbling blocks that lie between the actions and their execution. The actions in those plans, if they are already executed, never lead to the result that were sought. Tremendous amount of time and energy are lost because of that. In other words, enormous amounts of time can be bought if ways are found to deal with those stumbling blocks. That then became the focus of the webinar that resulted in the book that we are launching today. That webinar took place during 3 days in February 2021. 20+ world-class experts from all over the world actively participated both in the webinar and in the production of the book. That is what I wanted to say. About the origin of the book. Now I would like to make a few comments about the book itself. The timing for its publication happened to coincide with the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in Glasgow, in the COP26. The 2021 IPCC report that preceded that conference stated unequivocally that time is up and that we need to move into actions mode immediately. So the publication of the book is very timely. It also addresses key conditions for moving into the action mode immediately, namely the urgent need to deal with the stumbling blocks that stand between plan and effective action. In the discussions leading up to the webinar, we identified 5 categories of such stumbling blocks: finance, talent, vested interest, bureaucracy, and political will. Pages 102 and 103 of the book describe them in detail. It turned out that one way or another, all the participants to the webinar shared similar experiences with these stumbling blocks and all struggled with ways to deal with them. In the webinar, we came to a number of conclusions, some of which I will share with you now. The first one is that stumbling blocks don't stand alone. They're closely interconnected. So addressing one stumbling blocks will not suffice to overcome the difficulties, as it will in fact exacerbate the other stumbling blocks. Second conclusion was that stumbling blocks emerge when stable systems are forced to change. Climate change forces changes on systems much faster than systems can handle in their natural ways, causing stumbling blocks to appear between the plans for action and the execution of such actions. Conflicts with stumbling blocks must be avoided. At best, such conflicts will be a waste of time and resources, and we do not have the time. At worst, it will make no difference, leaving humanity in an even more precarious state than it presently is. Thus, the main path to deal with the stumbling blocks is to find ways around them. Exploring ways around stumbling blocks is what the book Buying Time for Climate Action is all about. As all the participants in the webinar were world-class experts, we feel that the book presents the state-of-the-art of dealing with stumbling blocks. As the problems resulting from climate change get bigger and the number of people potentially affected increases, there is a growing urgency for grassroots action and initiatives to find ways to cope with the problem. Grassroots initiatives allow actions to be taken quickly. This is because the actions are taken at a local level, local scale, where essential goals like circularizing economies can be reached most cost effectively. There's already a global connection of grassroots initiatives to be used as templates. Some are more effective than others, and we can learn from all of them. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. At the same time, actions focused on global impact, top-down coordination is necessary. This can be done by the same institutions and collectives that currently form the stumbling blocks. Their relative immobility can become assets, and they can actually provide stable, predictable support for grassroots aspirations. This way, trust can be restored in those systems at a time when trust is waning. We must think globally and act locally, and we must act now. This approach allows us to avoid the pitfalls of one-fits-size-all planning, where one inflexible operation is replaced with another at a time when flexibility is paramount. In following this path, we need to get the words that we use right. Just 2 examples. We should talk about political nerve, not political will. The nerve to tell people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. To tell people the bad news and to assert a bold vision for effective action, which means being proactive. And then there is a new normal. There can be no return to what is familiar and what we take for granted. Actions to begin to cope must begin now and must continue into the foreseeable future. And then one final comment. Young people, our grandchildren, intuitively feel that humanity is in big trouble because of climate change. They demand action from our generation, their grandparents. And we find it hard to help them because our generation, at least in the West, has been trapped in the illusion that making plans to solve a problem is equivalent to solving the problem. It is not. What we can help the younger generation with is making them see that what we learned about stumbling blocks is making them see what we learned about stumbling blocks and exploring ways around them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vesvinder. Can we now screen the video before we launch the book? Thank you.
On September 28th, Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg basically complained that
we can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action.
She's right. Everybody is hoping that there will be more action and less talk. The situation is getting worse. During the pandemic, 6 friends and I Zoomed almost every fortnight to find solutions for more climate action. The result is this book, Buying Time for Climate Action, which is the result of a webinar that we held this February.
The book, Buying Time for Climate Action, Exploring Ways Around Stumbling Blocks, shines light from different angles of how humanity could deal with climate change. There is no one silver bullet. There is no one size fits all.
That book concerns a major shift in the sustainability debate from asking what is necessary to achieve sustainability to asking what is blocking the implementation of concrete solutions. The 7 principal speakers have outlined the barriers in their domains, ranging from food and water to epidemics and cities. The 16 other authors have thoroughly examined their remarks and contributed to the theme of the book from their own expertise and experience.
And what we hope to lay out in this book is a bit of a roadmap that shows how we can go around those institutions, go to the grassroots, ask individual groups of people what they want and what they need. And hopefully this would be a way to involve the institutions in a positive sense, not only to help solve the problems, but also to begin earning new trust in the institutions themselves.
Young people, our grandchildren, intuitively feel that humanity is in big trouble because of climate change. They demand action from our generation, and we find it hard to help them. Because our generation, at least in the West, has been trapped in the illusion that making plans to solve a problem is equivalent to solving the problem.
Climate change mid to late this century may ultimately render unsustainable both inland and coastal metropolitan areas and set in motion unprecedented population displacement. With 800 million people in more than 570 coastal cities at levels of risk by 2050 from sea level rise, and a similar number inland likely to be displaced by desertification, where will these populations find acceptance?
The first is the notion that the biosphere is already beginning to cope with climate change by evolving, as it has always done. And this includes the outbreak of emerging diseases. So coping with climate change by evolving means pathogens moving into new hosts and into new geographical distributions. And it's important for us to understand that human beings are helping pathogens with their evolutionary process.
The oceans play a crucial role in absorbing CO2 and producing oxygen. Keeping marine ecosystems robust and healthy is essential to fight climate change. We are mostly overexploiting the top of the food web in the oceans, but are hardly using the more abundant sources of protein in the lower parts. We're using too many fishing and fish culture technologies that are wasteful, energy inefficient, and ecological disasters.
For too long, we have been invoking innovation to get us out of trouble, willfully ignoring the fact that 250 years of technological and institutional innovation have got us into trouble. We cannot keep going in the same direction. We ask, therefore, what is behind the inertia in our societies that prevents them from changing rapidly enough to deal with the oncoming disaster?
That is that our major institutions have become stumbling blocks rather than solutions to our problems. They are too rigid and committed to imposing one-size-fits-all solutions from the top down everywhere around the world. This is not working, and the globally bungled response to the COVID pandemic shows that this is not, our system is not working.
Conflicts with stumbling blocks must be avoided. At best, such conflict would be a waste of time and resources, and we do not have time. At worst, it would make no difference, leaving humanity in an even more precarious state than it presently is. As the problems resulting from climate change get bigger and the number of people potentially affected increases, there is a growing urgency for grassroots actions and initiatives to find new ways to cope with the problem.
So the transitions required in the coming decades are truly unprecedented. And unless planning and capacity building begins soon, humanity is unprepared to deal with the climate-triggered displacement and resettlement at this scale. We must now better predict and prepare, not waiting till 2050 and beyond, when levels of chaos from displaced multitudes become unmanageable.
To buy time in times of climate change, humanity must become more water resilient and manage its water better. Management of the resources, management of the water uses, and management of trust and emotions of the humans affected by water management decisions.
Reducing fishing intensity and lowering energy use is simply said, but has proven difficult to do. To be more realistic and politically acceptable, it needs to balance multiple factors: social, cultural, financial, and equity considerations, but also technology limits, risks, and the already mentioned externalities. Whatever you do, reduce uncertainty and risk for all stakeholders, big and small, and seek real fairness in the distribution of the cost, losses, and risks when making changes.
Grassroots initiatives allow actions to be taken quickly. This is because the actions are done at a local scale where essential goals like circularizing economies can be reached most cost effectively. There is already a global collection of grassroots initiatives to be used as templates. Some are more effective than others. We must learn from them.
But increasingly, the world is changing. The world is becoming more aware because of more forest fires, hotter weathers, more natural disasters. All these suggest that we need to act now.
It is not climate change that we should talk about, but climate emergency. We should talk about political nerve, not political will. It is the nerve to tell people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. To tell people the bad news and to assert a bold vision for effective action, which means being proactive.
I learned from writing and contributing to this book that resilience can only be achieved by accepting and learning from the local people and their knowledge, built up over centuries, then incorporated this knowledge into designing locally relevant solutions.
But most of all, our conclusion was that actually there is a lot of technical know-how that can actually work on climate change. This book will help you, and we hope you will be able to read it and give us our feedback on where we can move better on climate action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Clearly, this is a very important for us to think about grassroots initiatives, the wisdom from communities in affecting change. Thank you very much for this. So without further ado, may I invite Tan Sri Andrew, Distinguished Fellow of Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong, and former Chairman and Trustee of KRI, as well as one of the contributors of the book, to give the book to Tan Sri Nur Muhammad Yaakob as part of the launch. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tan Sri Andrew. Thank you, Tan Sri Noyakub. We have now concluded our launch, and we will now go into the panel discussion. In between, we will have a 2-minute break before we go to the panel discussion. Whilst waiting, if you would like to purchase this book, you can do so on the online screen. As shown on the screen now. Thank you. So we will start our panel discussion in 2 minutes' time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We will now start our panel discussion on financing for climate action. As mentioned before, effective climate action requires reconciling the science and the genuine action on the ground to deliver solutions that combat global warming and protect vulnerable communities and nature. We will listen to a presentation by Tan Sri Andrew Sheng and our panel of experts with experience ranging from finance, policy to grassroots climate projects, who will discuss on how local and international finance can be mobilized to support genuine climate solutions in Malaysia. However, before that, a brief introduction of all our panelists. Let me begin with Tan Sri Andrew Sheng. Tan Sri Andrew Sheng is a former central banker and a financial regulator in Asia and a commentator on global finance. He is Pro-Chancellor of Bristol University and Distinguished Fellow, Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong, as well as Chairman, Georgetown Institute of Open and Advanced Studies, Wawasan Open University, Malaysia. Tan Sri Andrew is the Chief Advisor to the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, a member of the International Advisory Council of the China Investment Corporation, China Development Bank, and China Securities Regulatory Commission. He has written, I've read a lot from him and learned a lot from Tan Sri. He has written extensively on international finance and monetary economics, financial regulation, and global governance, and sits on several international, regional, and national boards and advisory panels. Our second panelist, Mina Rahman, Head of Programs of Third World Network, as well as President of Sahabat Alam Malaysia and a practicing public interest lawyer. She has been involved in the UN Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, meetings, as well as the Paris Agreement, advising developing countries and civil society organizations. She has experience in relation to the UNFCCC's Green Climate Fund, which is the largest climate fund, as an active observer on the board of the Green Climate Fund. Next, we have Mr. Faisal Parish, Director of the Global Environment Center, a Malaysian non-profit organization working throughout East and Southeast Asia on forest and peatland management, biodiversity, water resources, and climate change since 1998. He is a wetland ecologist with more than 35 years experience in assessment and management of peat, swamp forests, mangroves, and river systems. He is currently assisting ASEAN in the development of a US $1.5 billion investment framework on sustainable haze-free land management in Southeast Asia. Next, Yin Xiao Lung is our own Senior Research Associate at Khazanah Research Institute, KRI. He focuses on industrial policy, climate change, and future technologies. He has spent a decade working in federal and state governments, and another decade in civil society and academia. Last but not least, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Research Advisor at KRI and Visiting Fellow at the Initiative of Policy Dialogue, Columbia University. He was a professor at the University of Malaya, Emeritus Professor now, Founder Chair of International Development Economic Associates, Ideas, UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group and on International Monetary Affairs and Development, and Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. Professor Jomo received the 207 Vasily Leontev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Tan Sri Andrew Sheng to present his thoughts on financing for climate action.
Thank you very much, Soraya. First of all, I'd like to thank Tan Sri Noor Muhammad Yaakob, my old friend and chairman of the Khazanah Research Institute, for making this webinar and launch of the book possible. I'd like to, of course, say thank you to Jan Vashpinda, Jomo, Mina, Xiaolong, and Farish for joining this panel. I'm going to be very quick. Because this webinar is held in Malaysia, I want to talk about where do we go from here, COP26, what we can do in Malaysia, not from a theory perspective, from a practical point of view. Okay, so the first part, you've heard a lot about, but it's all this blah blah after COP26 in Glasgow. Okay, Boris Johnson said we're growing up, but we really have serious problems. Now, the IP66 has shown that climate warming is in serious danger. We don't have time. Okay. After 30 years of climate warming, carbon emissions are still increasing and increasingly, faster and warming up. The COP26 results we hear from everybody, nobody is happy. Lots of promises. How do you deliver? So the real issue is that between 1961 to 2017, the population of the world doubled. And as the large part of the population uses more energy, more carbon output per capita, the bio capacity is reduced, and we've got a planetary crisis on our hands. But if you really look at what's happening, everything is going up hyperbolic, okay? And even growth, monetary creation is hyperbolic. When we consume by borrowing, we actually consume resources that we don't have. Next, please. So if you look at the monetary creation, QE, quantitative printing, is limitless. If you ask any private asset manager, minimum 12% per year return, compound growth. But if you look at the forests, and you ask a forest to deliver without borrowing 3% per year. Okay, so we're really reconciling impossible situations. Next, please. Right. So what are the impacts? The World Bank, all the IPCCs say that the system would cost us 2.3% of world GDP by 2030 per annum, right? And next, these GDP losses will be in the middle income countries, particularly emerging markets, in which even Malaysia is included. But as the climate change and the biodiversity worsens, they actually reinforce each other. As Jan Vashpinda said, this is all entangled, right? It's not about one cause. It's, 1,001 things all happening at the same time. And we have difficulty dealing with one, but we have the problem with the other. Now, business as usual is not possible. Okay, we are losing 46 million hectares of natural land, within the next 10 years, right? So what is being done after, COP26? Well, the agreements at COP26 is not going to be enough, all right? We will not reach 1.5% of degrees centigrade. The best, maybe we reach 1.9. But if you really then look at the range is huge. That means the countries that are suffering from extreme heat or extreme cold will really be very badly hit. Okay, so we can't talk about average, right? Now, the United Nations said that we will have 17 sustainable development goals. If you look at all this, environmental, social, governance, they're broken down to 139 specific steps at the global level. But actually, if you come down to the national level, it's worse because we are now talking about ESG for all companies to be compliant. Hello, there are no single standards on ESG, right? If our corporate sector in Malaysia all move to ESG and we cannot do it, what happens? So COP26 led by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who is now the special envoy on climate for the United Nations, $130 trillion worth of investors say, we will push the companies to net zero. If they don't go ESG, we will cut off lending to them. We won't invest in them. Hello, we in the emerging markets, if we do not comply with ESG, the money will be cut off. The trouble with green finance, it has a danger of being a bubble. $130 trillion looking for ESG. If emerging market companies cannot meet ESG, money will go to advanced company markets, the companies that will get ESG. But the problem is, it's not their money, they're printing it, but we in the emerging markets are net lender to the rich countries now. It is no longer money has been flowing uphill. Poor countries are putting their money in New York, London, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, etc., right? But if the ESG says the money cannot go back because you do not comply with ESG, we are committing harakiri. So my point to you today, particularly for Khazanah Research Institute, is that if we don't get our act together, our companies will be victimized by so-called brown finance. If you are not green, you are brown, therefore we will not lend or invest in you. But who sets the standards? The United Nations has only this year included natural capital into the calculation of SNA, the System of National Accounts. Only this year. There is no single standard in the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, on ESG. No single standard, which means every company says, I meet the standard, but who is the investor going to trust? A European, American company who says, I meet the standard, or an Indonesian company, an African company, or a South American company. You guys don't meet standards, so I will not invest in you. And that is why there are 7 billion of us, right, who are in the lower income category. The rich countries will look after themselves because they have the money. They can print the money. But if we don't get our standards together, we will be the victims of so-called green finance. Now, I'm not saying this because I want to be discriminatory. I just want to say, let's wake up and let's take action. There is no theory to guide us in climate change. Nobody has gone through this before, not the best or the brightest. Okay? The people who understand the most about climate action are the people on, sorry to use the word, coalface. They are the agriculturalists, the fishermen, the people at the cutting edge. And when the climate changes, if you live in the Maldives or in the Pacific Island, your country will disappear because nothing to do with you, because somebody has been burning carbon in the rich countries rather than you yourselves. So if we don't get our act together to try and define these standards, define the projects and the programs to take action on climate change, we will become the victims. And that's why how to move our corporate sector to ESG, is really the key question. Okay. Now I've already talked how about post GFC, GDP as a development goal is no longer acceptable. All right. Okay. The World Bank has now integrated, nature into development, but this is only just beginning. Okay. And natural capital accounts for 23% of low-income countries and 10% in the lower middle-income countries. Okay, So 44 trillion of global value added from just biodiversity and ecosystem services. But if we don't get money invested, we can't release this value added, right? So, there's a story by this Indian movie maker who says, if we don't tell our story, nobody else will, right? So we in the emerging markets now must actually begin to tell our side of the story and act on this. Now, the production of the system of ecological and economic accounts, the national balance sheets requires a strategic plan. And the Khazanah Research Institute, as the heart of this area, can help the government and the private sector develop this strategic plan, not just, offensively to try and address the climate change issue, but also defensively. Because if we don't defend ourselves, nobody else will. Now, the climate action is across 6 sectors. All these sectors, I don't want to go into detail, but the plans are all there. The United Nations IPCC have published all these plans. But how to implement this, nobody knows, because there are 200 countries in the world trying to implement this. Okay? There are 53,000 companies that are listed in the world that are trying to implement this. So there are 6 sets of climate actions to close the gap. These have been identified, but at very high levels. So if you're a company director, how do you implement this when there's no standard? Okay, so these are very practical issues, and I'm very practical in this. Now, all the reductions in carbon described by the international economic agencies for the 2020 says there are technical solutions all available, but the technical solutions are not available to some of these poor companies, some of these small companies. If you are a very small bank with only 50 employees, how the hell do you meet, Basel III? Same here. How do you, a small SME with only 20, 30 employees, meet ESG standards set by the IFRS somewhere in London, elsewhere, who has no clue what happens on the ground? They only deal with the big companies. The big company says, I want this, or they'll do this. Because the poor has no voice, right? So this book, Buying Time for Climate Change, basically says we need to take action. As Jan just repeated, the time is now. How do we find the ways of stumbling blocks? No theory, only practice, only experimentation. And this is the plea that I make to all my Malaysian friends, right? We need a one earth balance sheet, the balance sheet that does not show the finance or the liabilities or the assets, but also natural capital, which affects us all. So once we have a one earth balance sheet, we realize, as Martin Luther King said, we may arrive on different ships. He was talking about ships arriving in America, but we are all in the same boat. We are all in one planet Earth. We fight each other, the planet loses, humanity loses, right? So having a one earth balance sheet shows to everybody we need to take care of everybody because we are in the same boat. So the McKinsey Global Institute has just published the global balance sheet, assets of $1,530 trillion, okay? 1/3 of which is basically printing of money from the rich countries, right? So over the last 2 decades, the balance sheet has accelerated too fast, all right? And that's why the asset markets have been bubbling. So think about this. In the worst pandemic ever, stock markets are higher than ever. The rich are doing better than ever. And then they tell the poor countries, you deal with your own problems. Okay? So we really need to wake up that, the net worth is not just about calculating that your asset is my liability, and as long as I take your money into my pocket, the world will be fine, because we're all in one planet. We burn up the planet, everybody loses. So, to conclude, very simply, climate change is system change. As Jan and my friends were said, this is entangled system change. It's very complicated. but global warming and biodiversity loss will hurt all of us. Malaysia is very lucky. Malaysia is a relatively small population, lots of natural resources. Okay, our forests and our seas are probably doing more carbon capture. But if we're not careful, we will even damage this, and we can see how we emerging markets have a lot to do. So the SDG to the ESG green finance will hurt the non-compliant ESG companies and economies. So Malaysia must stay ahead of the curve. If we don't take care of ourselves, nobody else will, all right? So I'm pleading to all my friends, particularly the leadership of the Khazanah Research Institute and the KNB, that if we have the show the thought leadership and change agent, Malaysia could be ahead of the curve and actually contribute to more climate action for the benefit, not just for Malaysia, but for the rest of the world. Thank you very much indeed. I closed it.
Sorry, sorry. Sorry. Thank you, Tan Sri Andrew Sheng. That was a very, very inspiring presentation. At the same time, highlighting many things that could be an opportunity for us if we think on our own 2 feet. I won't say much here, but I would like to invite Mina Rahman, fresh from COP26 and years of experience with the climate finance architecture, to share her thoughts and maybe rise up to the challenge of Tan Sri Andrew. How do we actually do this? Thank you, Mina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to KRI, and thank you to Tan Sri Mohammad Noor, and also to the KRI team, Tan Sri Andrew Sheng, and all the others who produced the book. I'm very happy to, please go to my next slide. I'm very happy to be on this panel because years ago, when Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar was actually head of Khazanah, we did produce, the late Martin Kaur and myself, who's my husband, we did actually produce a paper for Khazanah saying how important if the Khazanah companies could actually take climate change on, and together with that influence PNB companies, we could actually be far ahead in terms of Malaysia's private sector, particularly those with the government actually. So I'm happy that we are having this discussion. I've been told that I have 8 minutes and I'll try to rush through as much as I can. I do also want to say something about what Tan Sri Andrew Sheng said about biodiversity and all that, but I'll come to the end if I have time. Otherwise, I'll take it up at question and answer. Now, the means of implementation at the international level, you know that the Framework Convention on Climate Change, this is the international agreement which came out of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, of the Rio Summit 1994, the Framework Convention was ratified, and the provision of climate finance and technology transfer from developed to developing countries is a very integral part of the commitments of developed countries, particularly because of their historical emissions. So this is really a framework, an agreement, a treaty for international cooperation. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to plug this and just very quickly say that in the discourse at the international level, many developing countries actually call on what's called repay the climate debt. So it's not about, this is not aid, this is not charity, this is not ODA. This is about the repayment of the climate debt because of the rich world having grown without any constraint on their carbon emissions and their historical emissions, and the current cumulative emissions are actually responsible for a lot of the warming that we are facing today. So the use up of the atmospheric space it's finite, and 60% of that atmospheric space has already been used since industrial times and today by the developed world. Very little carbon space is left to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We only have this decade to do that. Next slide, please. So the scale of the challenge is phenomenal, and actually at the last year, this was a very important presentation, or maybe I forget, maybe in June this year, UNCTAD actually delivered a very important statement during the subsidiary body meetings in preparation for Glasgow. And what they did say was that developing countries can no longer achieve their ambitions set out in Agenda 2030, which is the SDGs, and the Paris Agreement due to the pandemic. And what they did say is that we need international cooperation of a North-South kind, of an unprecedented, on an unprecedented scale, for the interconnected economic, social, and environmental challenges. And they estimated that what is needed at the minimum is 2% of global GDP, upwards of 1.7 trillion per year for the next few decades. Next, please. So we have this famous 100 billion per year by 2020. This was actually decided in Copenhagen in 2009, and it was reaffirmed in Cancun. This 100 billion by 2020 was a figure that was not based on any assessment of needs of developing countries. It was plucked out of a hat by Hillary Clinton at that time, the US Secretary of State at that time. And that's how we arrived at that 100 billion per year by 2020. And they have been failing to meet this promise. And in 2025 in Paris, that goal got shifted to 2025. Next, please. So the 100 billion claims, if you see, there's a big dispute. The OECD actually says that 78 to 80 billion actually has been mobilized already. And the shares of loans in total public finance provided, if you can see, much of it is actually loans and very little in terms of grants. And there's a continued stress on private climate finance, which actually doesn't, Mark Carney talks about the trillions, but that trillions actually hasn't been flowing. Next. Then you have Oxfam, which is has been studying the OECD claims. And what they say is actually climate-specific net assistance in 2017 to 2018 was only in the realm of 19 to 22.5 billion. Very little, very far away from what the OECD claims. And again, they also underscore the fact that loans are far higher, grants are much less, only about 20%. And in terms of financing for adaptation versus mitigation, mitigation is emissions reductions. People forget that there's a very important part of adapting to climate change as well. That has always been an orphan, and it only gets around 25% or so of climate funds. And then you have the small island states, 50% of what has gone to them was actually in loans. And if you go to the LDCs, 66% in loans, and this was well before the pandemic struck. Next, please. So the definition of climate finance has been a very major issue in the UNFCCC, and this is because how the OECD comes to its big figure actually depends on the methodology that is used, and the developing countries for umpteen years have been calling out for an operational definition of what's climate finance. I seem to have lost, yeah, okay. Next, please, next slide. So if you look at the needs of developing countries, now there's what's called the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. You know of this. And if you add up those NDCs of developing countries, what they have estimated is actually $5.7 to $5.8 trillion needed by 2030 to implement the SDGs to implement the NDCs from 2021 to 2030. And of this, 500 billion is what they expect in international resources. And if you look at adaptation needs, I can't run through all the numbers, but it's really very, very high compared to what is there on the table. And in fact, if you look at the Global Commission on Adaptation, they have estimated US 1.8 trillion from 2020 to 2030 for adaptation alone. And we're not even talking loss and damage, which I will mention if I have the time. Next, please. Where are we on the funds? There are several international funds set up under the UNFCCC. The Global Environment Facility was one of the first of them. Unfortunately, in the 7th replenishment, it was 40% less than the previous replenishment. It actually is not where we should be. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, this was actually a very important fund set up in Songdo. This also has money for the private sector, money for also the governments, a very important fund, but very few people know about this. And it was actually set up under the Cancun Agreement. And the current, what they have is the pledges and commitment is US 10.3 billion. still very far away from where we need to be. And so the other fund is the adaptation fund. At the moment, it is voluntary contributions, and the pledge of 356 billion came in Glasgow. Very little, very minuscule, very tiny, very peanuts. Next, please. So one of the Glasgow outcomes was that I've got a last 2 or 3 slides, which is about what happened in Glasgow. There's a big fight over long-term finance. This issue of whether we should even have a conversation to continue on long-term finance were totally disputed. And finally, there is an agreement that we will continue to talk about long-term finance, and there is a process to review this 100 billion per year and whether the developed countries have met that target. And this is being done by what's called the Standing Committee on Finance. It's a body set up under the UNFCCC to monitor and verify what is coming in. And so that's a very important process. The developing countries managed to win this because the developed countries did not want any conversation. Now, on the definition of climate finance, there was a slight win from developing countries, but the problem is the agreement, the decision from Glasgow actually says we will work out the climate finance definitions. Now, one of the problems with the definition is whether you include ODA, whether you include MDB money that developed countries give to MDBs. So what they tend to do is to escalate what is actually climate finance, and they add everything in there, including their mother, father, grandfather, and granddaughter. But what the developing countries are saying is that you really do need to have a very clear definition, and so that we don't escalate what should not be regarded as climate finance, which must be new, which must be additional, which must be mainly grant-based, and which must be predictable. And so for the Sharm el-Sheikh next year, COP27 is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh. There is going to be a high-level ministerial dialogue on climate finance, something that we all will follow, and to look at the progress on the 100 billion. And then there is also a very important call at Glasgow for doubling adaptation finance. Actually, they should come to 50-50 between adaptation and mitigation. Next slide, please. This is on the new collective quantified goal on finance. The 100 billion per year by 2020 was a pre-Paris Agreement commitment. Post-Paris Agreement, for the implementation of all that is under the Paris Agreement, there is a new collective goal that was agreed to in Paris in 2015. What was agreed to in Glasgow was actually to a work program. The developed countries did not want any work program. They just wanted to have talk shops and seminars, but they did not want to have a dedicated work program. So developing countries did succeed to have a robust program. And this is something that's very key. And for the people who are on this call and those of you who are following the finance issue, there is an opportunity to contribute, because there is, under this work program, they invite submissions from anyone, including even KRI. You can submit, or any agency that you want to submit, in terms of the needs assessment of developing countries. Because what developing countries want this time is the number not to be plucked from the air, but actually based on the needs of developing countries. So this will be very important. And by 2024, a new agreed goal has to happen under the Paris Agreement. Next, please. So I think I've come to my, okay, yes, continuing here. It's just based on the needs and so on. So let's close the slide, and I'll just make some final remarks very quickly. And that is, the finance challenge is phenomenal. The transformation, we keep saying that climate change is no longer, has never been about an environmental problem. It is about an economic problem. And I agree with the authors of the book. It is about system change. How do we do this transformation on a scale that has never been done? And that is a very key challenge. Just to very quickly respond to Tan Sri Andrew Singh, he talked about how do we meet this as with the ESG and so on. One of the problems that we've had from Glasgow is the net zero by 2050. And this is a real problem, because the developed countries were actually allowed to get away with net zero by 2050 targets. They don't have time to go to net zero. They have to get to real zero in this decade. No room for developed countries for net zero 2050. And if you look at their net zero pledges, much of it, and this is where I want to alert everyone, the scare is in the investments in the developing country natural resources. And this is a problem because it is about carbon trading. It is about carbon offsets. And I'm sure Jomo and others can also take this up. It is the wrong solution. So what they are really looking at is, including all the companies that are looking at net zero, what they are saying is they're going to pay developing countries to sequester, to plant trees or our oceans, which will be counted to their emission reductions. So the polluter can continue to pollute while they buy our carbon credits, and that is supposed to be a solution. That is a non-solution and a false solution. And the final danger that is on the horizon, actually it's not the horizon, it's very imminent next year, is what's called the carbon border measures. This is being pushed by the European Union under the trading arrangement. So what they're going to do, and they're going to be putting in place carbon border adjustments on all products of countries, including the developing world, on the basis that because of lower standards in our countries, they need to equalize that. So it's about a competitiveness. And so they're going to be levying carbon border adjustments on the borders, which we disagree with, and developing countries are fighting this. This is not international cooperation. This is actually competition, and they are trying to get an added advantage in order to claim that they are compliant. So a lot of challenges for developing countries in our private sector, and we do need KRI and others to take this very seriously, so that we are, in the name of solutions, we don't again pay the price, and particularly the poor. And I have come out with an assessment of Glasgow. I say that Glasgow was a setback for equity. It was a setback for the planet. It was a setback for the poor, but we have to continue to fight. And I agree, grassroots action is happening, and it's already there. We just need to work harder. But government has to be there as well. It can't just be left to people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mina, for that wonderful description of what happened in COP26, as well as the deliberations on to ensure that we don't get ripped off by the more developed nation. And I'm also quite interested to understand as well from what Tan Sri Andrew sharing in the book, and you mentioned as well that most action plans do not have pathways, do not have a work program, and it also depends on the scale of that entity or that firm. So with us, we have Faisal Parish, who actually has done some work on the ground. So we would love to hear from Faisal Parish, and on what are your thoughts on this? I mean, system change, what sort of scale, what sort of system policies that we might have to come up with? Over to you, Faisal.
Microphone, Faisal.
Thank you. Sorry about that. As Tan Sri Sheng highlighted, we need to broaden our understanding of the planet's balance sheet by including natural capital and recognizing the value of natural ecosystem services, and then managing those ecosystems, particularly those which are critical for the climate balance. I would like to highlight one specific ecosystem which covers about 7% of Malaysia's land surface, but is not well understood or valued by most Malaysians. And this is the peatland ecosystem, or ecosystem gambut. Peatlands are natural wetland ecosystems that accumulate thick layers of partly decomposed organic material or peat. Globally, peatlands are the most important carbon sink and store. Although they only cover 3% of the land area, they store more than 30% of the soil carbon. They also store nearly twice as much carbon as the biomass of all the world's forests combined. Peatlands are the only terrestrial ecosystem that forms fossil fuel, with all of the world's coal and part of its gas and oil reserves being formed by peatlands of millenniums past. Malaysia is lucky in that it has about, or had about 2.8 million hectares of peatlands, which were naturally covered with peat swamp forest and critical for carbon storage, with some peatlands in Malaysia having peat depths of more than 25 meters and storing up to 12,000 tons of carbon per hectare, compared with only 400 tons of carbon for other tropical forest ecosystems. The Malaysian peatlands are also critical for biodiversity conservation, with Malaysia having the best developed peat swamp forest with the highest biodiversity in the world. Peatlands also play a critical role for water regulation and supply, as well as local livelihoods. However, unfortunately in Malaysia, we've not managed this natural asset well, with about 80% of it being logged, cleared and drained for agriculture, plantation and urban development, and significant areas regularly burning or flooding every year. When we drain peatlands, we emit greenhouse gases, increase fire risk, disrupt water supply, eradicate biodiversity and enhance flooding. In drained peatlands, the peat layer will decompose or burn, reducing the land surface, and the land will subside up to 4 to 5 meters, making the area flood prone. We have more than 200,000 hectares of peatlands in Malaysia that are now facing regular fires, an increasing number of areas are flood prone, and this will increase with climate change. Peatland fires and associated haze are a major economic, social and environmental impact, as all of us in the region know from the very regular transboundary haze and also local haze generated from peatland fires in the region. An estimated 30 to 40% of Malaysia's greenhouse gases are coming from developed and degraded peatlands. However, this is hardly included in Malaysia's climate change strategy, as the information, even in the official government reports, seems to suppress the information on peatland emissions. We understand at the pressure of the plantation sector. If we're to meet our climate targets, as well as our sustainable development goals, we have to totally change our attitude and the management of peatlands and other critical natural ecosystems. Unfortunately, our neighboring countries are ahead of us, but also that means we can draw lessons from them. 10 years ago, Indonesia recognized the negative impact of peatlands and peatland development. They determined that peatland use and degradation contributed more than 50% of Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions, but contributed less than 1% to GDP. Since 2011, they have stopped giving new licenses for peatland development, and in 2016 adopt a new regulation to strictly control all activity on peatlands, in particular to ensure high water tables to reduce peat fire risk and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Since 2016, they have re-wetted or enhanced water management on nearly 4 million hectares of peatlands and significantly reduced the extent of peatland fires. They have also cancelled permits to phase out production in deep peatlands and required the re-establishment of forests. They also have the world's largest water monitoring network in peatlands, with 11,000 monitoring stations and real-time data monitored by central government for most locations. These measures have reduced greenhouse gas emissions, as well as reduced fire and haze, and enhanced management and production in many peatlands. Here in Malaysia, we need to improve our actions if we want to have any hope of meeting our emission targets. Some work has been initiated, such as the commitment to reduce emissions by 45% from business as usual and becoming net carbon neutral by 2050. But the practical measures to achieve these targets are not in place. In addition, Malaysia has introduced a ban on expansion of oil palm in peatlands and forest areas by the National Land Council in December 2019. But some companies are exploiting a loophole and planting other crops first and then converting to oil palm. A few companies are supporting small-scale peatland restoration projects near their plantations or through CSR activities, but major policy changes and significant resources are needed to drive change in the rest of the developed peatlands. At a minimum, the Malaysian government needs to enact similar legislation to Indonesia and control water management in peatlands, then steadily phase out agriculture and plantation on the drained peatlands. This will require significant resources, as well as developing new economically viable crops that can be grown on re-wetted peatlands, These are known as polluter-culture crops and have been developed in Indonesia and other countries. There are some positive candidates for these new crops, as peatlands in Southeast Asia naturally support a wide variety of plants, many of which have significant natural values. Sago palm, gelatong, which is the swamp rubber, and ramin are good candidate species to be developed. A more important alternative is to maintain and enhance the important carbon sink functions of peatlands. If a peatland contains 10,000 tons of carbon, which if degraded could release 36,700 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare, if we value that at the current price of US $600 for removing 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere by carbon capture and storage, the value of a very deep peatland could be as much as 88 million ringgit per hectare. Even if we take a shallower peatland and a very low price of $5 a ton, a peatland would have a value of more than 500,000 ringgit, way more than the value for any agriculture crop. Despite the obvious value of maintaining and restoring peatlands for their carbon storage value, there is little or no carbon finance flowing to management or maintenance of peatlands in Malaysia. The barriers to this are contradictory policies at the national level that have encouraged the development of peatlands throughout the country, lack of clear carbon financing mechanisms or opportunities, conflicts between federal policies and action by state governments, as most revenues from the state is collected by the federal government through income tax, forcing the states to continually develop their land to generate income. We need to put in place measures that put clear incentives and mechanisms for the states to better protect peatlands and forests and to phase out all drainage in peatlands. We need to establish a carbon price or tax in Malaysia to generate resources to channel to action in protecting and restoring peatlands and forests. With regard to the international funding flow, I agree with Mina and others that we need to be careful not to sell our peatland and forest for cheap carbon offsets. However, at the same time, at least initially, we may need to draw on international finance to scale up measures to make a paradigm shift in peatland management. However, we need to do that in such a way that will not lock us in to certain framework and will not affect the opportunity for us to meet our national priorities. If we protect and restore our peatlands, we can help protect our climate and also maintain and restore other ecological goods and services from the system. Finally, I'd just like to mention briefly the ASEAN initiative to develop an investment framework for sustainable haze-free land management in Southeast Asia. This is targeted at trying to transform current practices of land development and management that involved land clearing and fire and lead to large-scale transboundary haze in many countries in the region. A target has been set of $1.5 billion US over the next 10 years to help facilitate change in land use management, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, fires and transboundary haze, as well as enhance sustainable livelihoods. This initiative is intended to be a multi-stakeholder initiative with government, private sector, international finance institutes, and civil society engaged. We also hope that significant climate-related funds will be enabled to flow by this initiative. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you very much for that very engaging presentation of what could be done for the peatland ecosystem in Malaysia. It's quite interesting how, you have the natural balance sheet for the world, and yet when there's value but it's not monetized, state governments don't look at it. So, Xiaolong, which brings me to my next panelist, Xiaolong. Can our government, since you've been in government before, can our government really be as stern as the Indonesian government? And how do we ensure that the government's climate action plans can be something that we can really make systems change? The floor is yours, Xiaolong.
Thank you, Dr. Suraya. And thank you to Jan, Tan Sri Andrew, Mina, and the rest of the panel for sharing your thoughts. Just to respond to some of the issues just brought up by Dr. Suraya, and also Faisal. On the issue of governments and also the systems that we have, when I was working in state government some years ago, we declared a moratorium 25 years on logging because we felt that it was important to conserve the natural resources primarily for water catchment, and we'd logged close to 70% of the state already. There was only 30% forest left, and there was more value to be made from other forms of development that were less ecologically destructive. So we stopped logging, and then one year we received a sort of reprimand in the Auditor General's report for not logging enough because we didn't maximize logging revenue, because the only way in which forests and trees were represented in value in terms of the national accounting system were as logging cess. And we felt a little put out by it because we thought we'd taken a very bold stand to stop logging. But then we were sort of getting told off about it. But then the Auditor General, within his rights, didn't have any other system of accounting to refer to. And so this goes back to what Tan Sri Andrew said earlier, that it's important to have these forms of what you call payment for ecosystem services become mainstreamed as soon as possible. And the government, the Economic Planning Unit in particular, has been working on this for close to 15 years or more. But the work is still ongoing to do the knowledge, labor, to evaluate and value all these ecosystems that we have in Malaysia, and we have a great deal. But that work needs to accelerate because time to act on the climate crisis is running out, and it's increasingly important that we get that kind of accounting on board, on the books, so that institutions of accountability, such as, say, the Auditor General and other, and even the legislatures of government as well, and government itself, can monitor and measure how we are doing in terms of safeguarding not just our national responsibilities to preserve biodiversity in Malaysia, but also our global commitments to do our little bit to mitigate climate change. Now, on the issue of mitigating climate change, I also want to turn to the issue of firms and also our global commitments. Malaysia, we emit about 0.7% of greenhouse gases in recent years. So we're a very small footprint in the larger scheme of things in the world. And developed countries like the US and Europe and so forth are far larger present and historical emitters. The amount of contribution that we can make to the global battle against the climate crisis is relatively little. At the same time, we are not absolved of some responsibility to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we have to put this alongside meeting the immediate local needs and demands of the climate crisis. And for me, that raises the issue of climate adaptation, because we are climate vulnerable, and we are climate vulnerable in diverse ways, from communities in Perlis down to fisherfolk in Johor, to people living on islands which are being overtaken by the ocean in Sabah, to other communities in the East Coast who are beset by dramatic floods as well. So this is also a problem for companies, because Malaysian companies on the whole have very little idea of what threat climate change presents to their operations in the future. The only company in Malaysia that has really done a climate vulnerability assessment is Petronas. And that's reported in Malaysia's report to the UN. Petronas surveyed about 1,000 of its properties and found about 10% of them are vulnerable to climate damage, principally floods. Now, they have the resources, of course, to undertake this kind of exercise. And the SMEs, like, they can't meet Basel III. Most of the SMEs here can't really undertake a flood survey. But it's important for the government as well as industrial organizations to kind of take this into account, to prepare these sectors to meet climate pressures. Because if an industry or even a major company succumbs to climate pressure, it will have a cascading effect down into the critical services that they provide, the employment that they provide, the communities who depend on them. One example would be, say, sewage companies. Sewage companies typically have their operations right next to rivers. Rivers will be increasingly vulnerable to extreme floods, dry periods. You get different problems depending on each type of weather or climate event. If you have floods too extreme, you will overwhelm the infrastructure, possibly damage or destroy it. If you have dry periods where the river goes down, you get intensified pollution, because what pollution does come out becomes increasingly concentrated in very little water, right? But sewage companies here, for example, haven't really taken climate change into account, even though they may be engaging in planning their next 20 years of capital expenditure. Likewise, the oil palm sector is quite unprepared for climate adaptation. Our official report suggests that the amount of oil palm cultivation land that is vulnerable to floods could increase by 460% by 2050. That's a lot. The industry doesn't yet know what to do. This is a brave new world of climate adaptation. And at the same time, our industries here are very afraid and very nervous about this threat, ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. While it's dramatically, morally and I would say operationally important to take these into account, I think we have to be clear that developed world priorities are not the same as emerging market needs. Emerging market companies have a different responsibility to respond to climate change than, say, developed world companies. The responsibility of Shell to respond for its historic contributions to climate change are not the same, I would venture, as Petronas as a national oil company of a developing country, where they provide a large proportion of our budget. Should Petronas be doing the same things like carbon capture and storage as Shell is proposing to do or Exxon is proposing to do? I would say maybe not. It's too high risk, too low reward, high cost as well. They should be focusing on maybe looking at supporting Malaysia's development and eliminating poverty in our country. They don't have the same responsibility as Shell. Now, there's that danger of narrowing corporate climate action to only mitigation. But I would say the companies have a responsibility to also take on adaptation, because there are entire economic sectors that sometimes depend upon them, and there are jobs that depend upon them, livelihoods, and so forth. So it's an increasingly important question for government to take on board. And the government doesn't sufficiently know what adaptation pressures to prepare for in the future. There is a national climate adaptation plan that is largely completed, but there remains a lot of scientific research that needs to be done to understand the impacts on specific sectors. Oil palm is one. Another issue would be what does our ports and shipping sector have to do to respond to 20 cm worth of sea level rise in the Malacca Strait? How will that affect the port of Klang, for example? What kind of costs will be involved in adjusting to that? What kind of measures, infrastructure development will be needed? Same for water companies as well, and the kind of critical infrastructure that they are providing. So I hear the issue of ESG, carbon border tax quite often, and the need for, say, Malaysian companies who are participating in global value chains to adjust to these kind of pressures. But the question is, how much of the Malaysian economy needs to adjust to that? How much do we need to push back and demarcate where our responsibilities end and where, say, the developed countries begin? I think we have to avoid what I would call greenhouse gaslighting, where gaslighting is a psychological tactic intended to warp a victim's perception of their own culpability or guilt for creating a bad situation. And there's a lot of greenhouse gaslighting coming from developed countries towards the global south. And it's important that we also mitigate that, and that we establish the proper sphere of climate action that is appropriate for both our historical responsibility as well as our present capabilities and needs. And this is not to take away any of the tremendously valuable work that Faisal has just talked about, because we have to protect our ecosystems. We need to insulate them also strategically in order to prevent the blame game being mounted against Malaysia for, say, deforestation that's happened here, as opposed to the lack of action on deforestation comparatively in countries like Europe or North America. So I've gone slightly over my time. I think I'll end here and I'll pass over. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahrukh. Very important to look into the development context of a country and see how that, in a way, sometimes create different alignment to what government might want to do regarding climate change. Very interesting discussion here, but I would like to ask Prof. Jomo, our last panelist, to maybe give some comments as well on the different inequities of a country's development trajectory and the international financial gap, and how best do we look at this? Because as mentioned by Tan Sri Andrew and the rest of the editors of the book, writers of the book, one size does not fit all, but the contexts are all different. So how do we do this, Prof. Jomo?
Thank you very much, Dr. Soraya, for the And thank you also to KRI for the invitation to participate in this excellent panel. I was anticipating what to do. I was trying to anticipate what to do as the last speaker. And so I've kept my remarks slightly tangential and slightly short, because I was quite sure that the previous panelists would all do excellent work in addressing the challenges which they have faced. So there are still, unfortunately, going to be gaps in what I present, but I would like to first congratulate Professor Jan Vasbinder and Tan Sri Andrew Sheng and their colleagues for this excellent contribution to the debate. And I think this is useful, but it's also important for us to try to go over some of the larger issues, some of which are addressed in the volume, some of which have been raised by our panelists. I think Meena Rahman has reminded us about the huge problems of climate finance. About a dozen years ago, when we were facing the global financial crisis, when I was working at the United Nations, the UN proposed a global Green New Deal involving $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Unfortunately, as you know, subsequently in 2009, President Nicolas Sarkozy and Prime Minister Gordon Brown and the European Commission proposed 100 billion. But as we have been reminded by Meena, even that 100 billion has not been delivered. Delivery has been about half that level, and mainly for mitigation, with next to nothing for adaptation and very little, very, very little for compensation for those who have already suffering the consequences of global warming. I think it's very important to recognize that it is very unlikely, given the current state of things, that we're going to make to go forward. Now, when one considers all these issues, I think the current projection by the IPCC suggests that it's very likely that we will move to about 2.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels, which when you translate that into Fahrenheit, which many people still use in this country, it is actually very, very serious. But more importantly, we also see the increased extreme weather phenomena, hurricane intensity or typhoon intensity, and also conversely, aridification, desertification, and a whole range of other things. Next, please. Next, please. Now, there are many effects which are pronounced in Malaysia, the extreme weather phenomena which I referred to earlier. We also know that Malaysia has, despite appeals for at least 4 decades ago, the deforestation has continued, and worse, we see not only devastation of the forest, but also that the timber rents have largely been salted away abroad and not contributed to, in any sense, to the development of the country. Now, it's in Kedah, the water from the Pedu Dam, which is important not only for Kedah, Perlis, and Penang and the province Wellesley or Seberang Perai, has now been severely compromised by extreme weather phenomena. In the last 5 years, at least 2 out of 10 planting seasons have been cancelled. We have also seen that the public-private partnerships, which were awarded about 3 decades ago, we have seen those independent power producers increasingly switching from diesel to dirty coal rather than moving to renewable energy, which could have been easily compelled by the government as the awarder of these contracts. Now, Malaysia is also, of course, potentially a major producer of renewable energy. We are the second largest producer of photovoltaic solar panels and the largest exporter to many countries in the West, particularly the United States. There's also tremendous potential with palm oil, biodiesel, and so on, which needs to be considered, but has not really been developed for well over 3 decades. Next, please. Now, Tariq Fancy, who used to used to be the chief investment officer for BlackRock, has reminded us that Friedman's appeal 51 years ago for shareholders to continue to decide corporate behavior still very much dominates. So the kind of feel-good for investing, to use his term, which you find in various types of sustainable investing, green investing, impact investing, responsible investing, ethical investing, and so on and so forth, are huge red herrings. And the Davos endorsement of environmental, social governance investing and criteria has actually not done very much. In fact, what it has done is basically to greenwash investments. So Mark Carney's claim that he has about 130 trillion is actually fairly misleading, because it does not tell us very much about what is being done with the resources available. We should not forget, for example, when Jim Kim was the president of the World Bank, what happened with all his blended finance and other initiatives. So we have to be wary about these purported solutions. Now, if we look at the government of Malaysia and the 12th Malaysia Plan announcement recently, we see endorsement of ESG, but ESG criteria are really for corporations rather than for governments. And we have no real elaboration on what it means for the public. Next, please. Now, one of the big problems, I think, for my profession and the profession of some of those who are participating in discussion is economists tend to resort to money metric measures. And this has been hugely problematic. We have seen, for example, that this view of the World Bank promoted from about 3 decades ago about the so-called fungibility of capital, leading Herman Daly to resign from the World Bank and become an academic once again, is a problem which implies that we are able to measure many of the consequences, and this is hugely problematic. Unfortunately, Professor Partha Dasgupta has promoted the idea of natural capital, which was initially elaborated by the World Bank, and we have seen huge problems associated with that. Now, if we look, for example, at some of the controversies around the very notion of capital, which has led recently, for example, to the notion that you can basically change different types of capital. You can move from natural capital to physical capital and so on and so forth. And I would basically argue that this kind of thinking is really absurd and hugely problematic and should be called out, especially by economists, because of their bogus assumptions which are being made. Almost a century ago, Arthur Pigou, a British economist, basically offered the idea of externalities. And economists have basically taken comfort in the view that, oh, by looking and recognizing negative externalities, we're able to deal with many of these problems. These problems are hugely problematic, as Lord Nicholas Stern reminded us, not only with problems of discount rates, but a whole range of other issues. Next, please. Now, I think it's, as time is running out, I think we need to recognize, as the authors of the volume recognize, the challenges of the Anthropocene, and particularly the challenges of the period since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution about 2 centuries ago. We also recognize that, that capitalism is the only show in the world today, and probably for some time to come. But there are a varieties of capitalism. And it's very important to recognize that law has often codified and entrenched systems in which we live, systems of contractual rights, and so forth. So it's very important for us to recognize that it's crucial and very necessary to begin to think, for us to think very, very seriously and carefully about how much of a tool law may be this effort. Michael Sandel, for example, of Harvard, has reminded us how all these problems have become hugely problematic. Let me stop here because I've been interrupting you with somebody who's insisting on calling me despite my attempts to decline the call. Thank you very much for your attention, and I do hope we take many of the reminders by the previous panelists as well. Thank you.
No problem, Prof. Jomo. Thank you. Thank you so much for that discussion, especially about how economies sometimes do this money metrics measures. And we're all taken by doing this, and yet it does not fulfill any real objective. Anyway, we are now up to our come to our Q&A session. How we will do this is that I will read out the question, and if any of the panelists would like to answer, please just raise your hand. Or just go straight into it. And if one panelist have answered, but another wants to add to it, please feel free to do so. So we have about a few questions here. So I'll read the first one. Over the decades, neoliberal climate and energy policies, which are tied to privatization and commodification, including capitalization of nature, have failed to halt the rise of greenhouse gas emissions. Given that the clock is ticking and the time's lost, what kind of time can we possibly still buy if we continue on this trajectory? Are there alternatives to which we can realistically embark on to steer us away from the slippery slope of climate crisis? Who would like to go first?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think Jan answered it. Think global, act locally. We can't solve the global problems. We can only solve our problems at our local level. And so this whole idea of neoliberalism that somebody up there can solve our grassroots problems is nonsense. Okay? Lots of preaching, no action. Therefore, loss of trust. All right? So, the whole idea of this buying time really is to understand this, that we have to act locally. We have to act on the problems that we can solve, not preach that somebody else solve it. Now, Mina, I want to answer your question. The issue that you raised. Why can't we get 100 billion? Stop financialization of climate change. Climate change is real issue, not a financial shell game. They will tell you the money is here, whereas they're taking the money there. They promise you 100 billion, they're taking away 200 billion. Forget it. Just concentrate on what we at the grassroots level can deal with. And that's why I say forget about trying to beg for the 100 billion, because that's what they want you to do. Concentrate on when they say ESG on 14 trillion, 2% of 14 trillion, you're already talking about something in the order of, $280 billion. All right? So you really need to concentrate at the local level. Now, I just want to focus on the how do we tackle this at the local level. The answer, which we discuss in this book, is to listen more. We're not listening to the grassroots level. Okay? Our feedback mechanism is from all the theories and not what's happening on the ground. Now, take Farish's plea on the parish, Mr. Faisal Parish argument on peatlands. I totally agree with him. But look at what he's demanding. He is demanding that the federal and the local cooperate. He is demanding that local companies stop abusing the peatlands. Just to finance the enforcement of this area when corruption is on the ground, how do you do this? Faisal, you are demanding, a lot of changes, okay? Not just at the policy level, but at the corporate level. at the enforcement level, at the standards level. It's even on one area, which is only 7%, as you say, of the carbon emission of Malaysia, we are dealing with what appears to be mission impossible. So we have to be not, let's do everything. Let's concentrate, let's prioritize and concentrate on what we can achieve. Okay? And if we don't get the private sector involved, just writing laws and tell the government to tell the private sector to do this, nothing will change. And that's why my view is, let's get the private sector on board. You are being hammered on ESG. Let's sit down and agree on what we can do and move forward in this area. It's a feedback mechanism that I'm pleading that we deal with, because there is no theory to guide us out of climate change. That part, I'm very clear, is our problem. There is no Nobel laureate. By the time we get a Nobel laureate on climate change, the climate may be burning already. Jomo said it absolutely right.
Sorry, Tan Sri. Most of the time, it's the firms that don't want to follow. I mean, most of the problems is because firms themselves don't want to do it.
No, but let me give you an illustration, right?
Yes.
This is very important. Why is the biggest winner for Malaysia for the last 40 years, palm oil, become the biggest loser? Let's ask a very fundamental question. Palm oil prices today is no longer 2,000 ringgit, it's 4,500 ringgit. And look at the stock price of all the palm oil companies. It's flat, if not declining. Why? Because the big investors in the world are selling out their palm oil. The biggest banks don't want to lend to palm oil because you are killing orangutans, you are burning peatlands, and you are doing bad things. Now, why hasn't our palm oil corporate captains woken up and said, I want to change into a orangutan reserve. I want to plant rubber trees. I want to convert some of our peatlands into exactly what Faisal says he wants to do. And then I want to borrow green fund at 0 interest rate from you. They're not doing this. Instead, they're trying to say, let's go up to the World Palm Oil Council and persuade them that palm oil is not, anti-carcinogenic. We're not thinking strategically, right? Your winners become losers. And that is the financialization of climate change. If you don't understand this, you will keep on beating against a wall in which you are going to lose. Forget it. Let's just move on.
Okay, Mina wants to have a response there, as well as Prof. Jomo. Okay, then we'll move on to the next question. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think we all are in agreement that there's no shortcut. And I agree with Tan Sri and Dusheng, the private sector needs to get engaged. But I also, the private sector will not do just because we talk to them. I think that Tan Sri and Dusheng also knows that. But I do think that the central bank, I'm not sure to what extent the audience here knows about that, the initiative, the taxonomy initiative of the Bank Negara. And they have actually are starting to look at educating these private sector, the banks especially, private sector banks, what you should be investing in and what you should not be investing in. And even for the first time, our NGO, Sahabat Alam, is engaging in that process to actually talk to the banks and say, like CIMB and Maybank and others, why are you, financing this in the wrong direction? So I think a number of us are beginning to use the finance way to direct the right financing and to divest from the wrong financing. That's one strategy. But what I wanted to bring in relation to this is the whole notion of the grassroots and the local. I mean, for the most umpteen years, I think all of you know this. I mean, Sahabat Alam Malaysia, Consumers Association of Penang, the whole Faisal and his, I mean, we all have been campaigning at the grassroots level, fighting our governments, fighting the corporations at the local level, at the council level, at every level. And I think a very important, this is really a clash of paradigms. That's the point I wanted to raise. the clash of paradigms in terms of the model of development. And we have gone on a development trajectory which is all wrong. And right from the Rio days, we already know that. Irrational consumption patterns, wrong production systems. So how do we make sure that we are in the right? And many of these indigenous peoples, and that wisdom of the indigenous peoples is really something that we should be appreciating instead of driving them out of the forest. So now in the name of ESG, and this is where Tan Sri, Andrew saying, the ESG is not going to be your answer. It's not the only answer. When BlackRock, and this is the other thing to Jomo, when you have Larry Fink and the Davos community suddenly embracing ESG as the solution of the world, the drivers of the destruction out of all these years, now suddenly becoming the problem solvers. I mean, we in the civil society, in the climate justice community, sit up and look, is this greenwashing? I think, Domo, you did talk about the greenwashing. So it's the Washington consensus, Davos consensus, reinventing themselves as the green. And this is happening in the carbon trading. Glasgow has legitimized carbon trading. Everyone is talking about carbon offsetting, and it is going to be displacing indigenous peoples. It's going to be violating, it's going to create land grabs. And so we need to be aware of the Larry Finks, the BlackRocks, and all these guys coming in to change the world. But when we have the real solutions on the ground, which have never been mainstreamed or acknowledged, and I do think that the central bank initiative is in the right direction. We have to work more with them, and this is the direction we are going. And certainly KRI, Khazanah, PNB, you can set an example. Building climate resilience, making your own companies much more climate friendly, and that's the direction. Our solution is important, and many of us are in the front line of the solutions, including being put in jail for taking up these issues and causes.
Thank you, Mina. If Prof. Jomo wants to add, because we have some question that's quite related to what is being discussed now. But if Prof. Jomo wants to add something,
perhaps you might.
I see your hand.
Read the other questions out and then give everybody a chance to respond, because Mina has said some of what I would have liked to say.
So if we can go up a bit, there's an anonymous, before we go for Dominic's question, anonymous, sorry. Okay, central banks, regulators, and capital markets all over the world are accelerating towards the greening of global financial system, with a significant flow of climate finance potentially provided by private institutions, following which requirement for disclosures, reporting frameworks, and standards are in great demand, including the convergence and standardization of ESG principles across countries. While this is pertinent to hedge against climate risks and meet certain SDGs, does this necessarily set up a complex financial, I think Mina said this, financial and investment ecosystem to which only large corporations can and will continue to amass the lion's share of this new economy? What are the system changes required in this new economy to ensure that elements of just transition anchored on equity and social justice are back into sustainable future where GDP is no longer used as a metric to measure growth? So answering a few of it. But yes, anybody wants to start? Tan Sri, yes.
Well, the problem is the central bankers are behind some of the fundamental problems. When the interest rate is zero or negative, the interest rate is no longer the price mechanism to have efficient asset allocation. Okay? Now, of course, the central banks would say, well, I got nothing to do with this. The politicians want to do whatever they want to do. They want to run deficits, et cetera, and therefore, we just, do what we need to do. And so in order to make everybody feel good, that is why some central bankers feel maybe we should push the financial sector to push the real economy to change. Hello, finance cannot push the real economy on a piece of string. Finance can pull back the real economy by using higher interest rates. But we have now seen since 2008 at zero interest rate, growth has not increased, investment has not increased, productivity has gone down. There is no investment, not even on climate change, but on even normal issue like social justice, education, health, etc., etc. So what makes the central bankers and the finance Wall Street guys think that their greenwashing will actually solve the problems of this world? So don't expect them to change. This is what I'm trying to say. The finance will not solve the real problems of this world. The real problems of the world will have to be solved at the real level. And the real level will have to be solved at the local level. We cannot expect rich countries to get their own act together, let alone to get the act for the world as a whole. That's my bottom line.
Coming back to real grassroots level, I think there's a question from Dominic Sullivan to Mr. Faisal. Malaysia still appears to be relying on avoiding making its potential contribution to the national and global challenge by playing the quote-unquote developing country card. While we agree we need political nerve and openness, we desperately need leaders to drive that. How do we achieve that? This is open to all as well. Faisal, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think we have been making use of the developing country card. I mean, maybe in the past it was legitimate, but I think given our rapid development in the many years, we need to have a more mature stand and recognize that the sustainable development is not something we should try to escape from as it's a requirement for developed countries only. It's essential for all of our people and for the sustainability of life in Malaysia. The degradation of ecosystems that has been allowed with the business as usual has destroyed the possibility for many local communities of having a sustainable life. They have lost their land, they have lost their resources, and so we have to change that and not let the government just say we need special privileges to carry on, or special privilege for certain elites to carry on stripping the country of its resources. So we have to get beyond this situation, and we really have to look seriously what we're going to do. The government now has set in the 12th Malaysia Plan a target to 2050 of moving to carbon neutrality, although net neutrality, and it depends how you measure that, whether it is real. We really need to look at moving to real neutrality, and we need to totally fundamentally change the way that we're managing, particularly we're managing the land. And that is where there is the potential for improved management. That's a natural asset Malaysia has, and we've been misusing that asset for the last, however, 50, 100 years, abusing it. So we have to change that to a more sustainable use of the land. We need to empower local communities. They are much better at managing the land than the government is, and that has been proved many, many times, but they need the backup and support of government. Their rights and tenure need to be recognized by the government, and not they're kicked off the land every excuse that is given, and not given elite companies to come in and grab their land. So we have to change that fundamentally. But if we put our faith in our Malaysian people and we empower them and give them the rights, then I think we can make a great more improvement than we have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm wary of the time. We only have 5 minutes left, but we have many questions. But if I might pose this question to all panelists to even have your last say for this session. But I think this question is very good for all to really talk about what we've really discussed today. So the question now is inclusiveness, institutional inertia, stumbling blocks versus urgency. When discussing solutions at the policy level, the very nature of our seminars are in high-level planning, strategizing, borders on exclusive. Plans that emerge also tend to lean to vagueness, take time to manifest, and are not easily adapted by grassroots communities. Can we afford to wait for legislative clarity in Malaysia, Or could we invigorate finance, resource, knowledge, problem solving, accountability to changing the way and spaces in which we converse and problem solve for the climate? And I want to add as well that we are still discussing, we want to have pathways and work program. So if you could add that as well in your final remarks. Can I start with Prof. Jomo, because I kind of cut you off just now, sorry. Prof. Jomo, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sraya. Let me answer the question which was posed earlier and which has been posed by the discussion we are having today. What are we buying time for, right? I do not believe that just buying time is a good enough solution, as important as it might be. And I'm also not convinced that local action alone is going to be enough. I think what we need is a full-blown alliance of people working at different levels. And this is where the international is almost as important as the national, as almost as important as the regional and the local. All these actions are absolutely necessary. We also always have the problem of collective action. How do we ensure collective action? And very often we find that that many of the people whom we are relying on may not be particularly concerned about climate action as opposed to all the other concerns which they have. We have seen, for example, how there has been very, very little progress on COVID-19 because of the greed of pharmaceutical and other companies providing medical technologies and products. So I think we have to recognize that the failure of collective action is a systemic problem. And this is why I appreciate the volume very much. And Andrew Sheng, more than any of us, knows the difficulty of working to try to direct finance, to serve the public interest. And these are huge challenges. So we need to act at many different levels. I'm afraid that simply relying on the communities who are going to be affected in the longer term may not be enough. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Prof. Jomo, if I might go to Xiaolong for your answer and last remarks.
Yes, thank you. I think it's tremendously important to have action at all levels, as Jomo has said. It's important for the local to speak up to central government. It's equally important that government needs to play its role, providing that kind of critical, long-term strategic direction that is needed. Unfortunately, climate action is usually very dependent upon the interest level of any given prime minister, let alone the minister in charge of climate change in any given administration. We've seen prime ministers come and go. Sometimes they're interested in climate change, sometimes they're not. And the agenda moves up and down accordingly. Increasingly, I think we have to demand that the prime ministers of the future that see us for the next few decades of the most intense periods of climate change have to make it a priority. And it has to pass down not only through whatever action plans the government develops, but also in terms of what companies and communities also take to protect themselves from vulnerabilities. And that's a critical issue for knowledge and for an outfit like Khazanah Research Institute, where perhaps we can play a role of trying to bridge that gap of knowledge, because people, companies, communities here don't often understand the ways in which they are vulnerable to the climate and also the ways in which they can take appropriate climate action. There are lots of questions going around. Companies don't often know what to do. Do we conform to somebody else's ESG standards? Do we sign up for certifications like B Corp and go under full auditing? What is carbon neutral versus net zero? How do we figure our way through this thicket of jargon and potential, jurisdictional traps? There's a need for knowledge to clarify that. We can play a small role, but we're not alone. It's tremendously important for government to also step up and step forward and take a more, give a clearer strategic vision, because we don't have a clear national climate plan. We have national targets, but we have no trajectory of how to get there. Are we going to take a fast road to, rapid road to decarbonization? Are we going to take a slow, easy road and maybe push it down the line and hope nobody notices? What are we going to do? Right? How are we going to prepare to face climate change that's going to happen in the next 10 years, 5 years, 20, 30? I believe, personally, I feel rather pessimistic given how the pandemic has gone, that the developed world will let us down. They will not take appropriate climate action. They will focus on the false market mechanisms and carbon offsets. And we in the developing world, and we're not the weakest, most vulnerable country, but we will be left to live with the pollution that they put into the atmosphere. So I feel that we have to prioritize protecting and identifying how to protect our most vulnerable communities.
Thank you, Xiaolong. If I may go to Faisal, then Meena, and then Tan Sri Andrew, and then lastly, just Professor Vespinder.
Thank you very much. I think we have to take a multi-track and multi-stakeholder approach, not just pick one option and hope it works out. We have to cover ourselves with multiple ways forward, multiple tracks. It's critical, I think, as I mentioned earlier, to empower local community to act as the good stewards of the land and to empower and support them to have a new way forward for that, a low carbon option for them. We also need to think also of the government regulation, and we need to regulate to better protect peatlands and forests and manage within those systems, such as I mentioned, the water levels and so on, and transform to more sustainable crops. If we keep on trying to grow dryland crops in wetland situation, we will always be working against nature. We need to work with nature in the right direction if we're going to succeed. And lastly, I think we do need to stimulate oil palm companies and other agri-business companies to transform themselves to forest restorers and carbon farmers to make use of the great resources that may be available to drive the emission down and to sequester carbon back on the land. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal. And if I could ask some comments from Meena, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with what everybody said. I agree with Faisal, I agree with Jomo, most importantly, working at all levels. And there are a lot of, I think knowledge is key. What are the kinds of solutions that are there? What are the pathways which are there? There are some countries in the developing world themselves who are very advanced in terms of the low carbon pathway, but it's not enough to focus on emissions. And this is, I underscore what Xiaolong is saying. Adaptation and building climate resilience is very key. We are not planning for the future. Many of our cities are going to go underwater. We're not even ready. And so we do need to do a lot of that. And also, I think we should be looking at carbon tax rather than emissions trading, which is really the problem. I mean, ideologically, we are following the developed world because they are anti-carbon tax, but carbon tax is something that can be done, and many countries have done that. And even the World Bank advances that. So we should be going in that direction rather than doing new things that we don't know about and emissions trading. And this is really in the wrong direction. And we do need to do a lot of knowledge, education, capacity building, and multi-stakeholder. So all of us need to be champions, and also at the international level, particularly on loss and damage. We did not talk enough. Jomo mentioned compensation. We don't talk about it as compensation because we are beyond adaptation actually. As the temperatures rise, the loss and damage and the increased typhoons and hurricanes, it's going to be worse than ever. And we don't have the financial resources, even if we are middle income country. We have not even done the costings of what we need to do in terms of needs assessment for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage, and for real climate action. A lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Meena. Tan Sri Andrew, before I pass it to Professor Vespinder.
Yeah, I think everybody has made very, very useful, contributions. Of course, we need to act at all levels. But if somebody so powerful, such as Greta Thunberg, cannot move the global leaders, what can we in Malaysia do? So I'm much more practical. Let those people who are good at the global level, let them deal with it. We deal with our own problems on our ground. Okay, so the action is actually at the local level. Doesn't mean that we don't complain about it, talk about it. Just give you a very simple illustration how this shocked me. Central bankers. I'm a former central banker. In 2008, the central bank assets was less than 5% of global financial assets. Today, they are $40 trillion, increased by 7 trillion in 1 year. How much is $40 trillion? Central bank balance sheets are now larger than the world's pension funds. You know, more than 1/3 larger than the world's insurance funds. So the money is there to do anything they want, except they don't want to channel it into climate change. If they were to allocate 10% of central bank balance sheet to buy green bonds, there will be more than enough money to buy any of the finance needs that we need. But they're not going to do it. Okay, you and I know this, they won't do it. All right, so the technical solutions are there, the finance is there, the political will or nerve, as Jan Vashbinder said, is not there. And so, you know, given that my time is limited, I don't think I'm going to start, you know, complaining at the global level. Let's just see what we can do at the local level. Let me just stop here.
Thank you, Tan Sri Andrew. And lastly, but not is Professor Jan Jasvinder.
Thank you. Well, to start with, I'm very impressed by the discussion. A lot of it goes above my head because I'm not a financial person, but I'm really impressed and I learned a lot. But there was one question that Jomo asked, why are we buying time? And I think that is a very relevant question. And my answer to that would be to prevent the global community that's largely based on technological advances of the last couple of 100 years to collapse. Because if the technological infrastructure collapses, there's no way to build it back up. And so then we'll be thrown back to very primitive situation that was maybe a couple of thousand years ago. I mean, that's really, I think, the threat. The humanity will not disappear, at least not for a long time, I'm quite sure. Many of them will disappear because of disasters if we don't take care. But the real reason to buy time on the time scale that we're now talking about is, I think, to make sure that we can continue living on the basis of the technological accomplishments that we have had, but living in a much more sensible and sustainable and good way. That's really my final comment. I agree with the need to work on all levels. I also think that we've been fighting the wrong collectives, or fighting the collectives wrongly for too long, and fighting the collectives is a waste of time. That's really a tremendous waste of time. Stop fighting the collectives and start working on a much more realistic basis. The local level, I think, is one way to buy time. This is what I would limit my comments to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. On behalf of Khazanah Research Institute KRI, I would like to really thank the panelists as well as Professor Jan Jasvinder for taking your time today to discuss on this very important issue of buying time as well as financing for climate action. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for spending your time with KRI today. We hope that this sharing session has been useful, and I have certainly learned a lot today. And we look forward to see you again in our coming events. There is one scheduled tomorrow, Building Resilience in Health Protection, starting at 2:30 p.m. Please do follow us on our social media platforms for our latest updates, events and publications. And again, thank you very much for our distinguished panelists and speakers. And thank you very much and have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.